What really happened to Indian Larry is a question that's been debated for years, mostly because the public version only shows a fraction of the full story. The event itself was simple, but everything surrounding it wasn't. What riders saw, what the media reported, and what actually unfolded don't all line up as neatly as people think. Tonight, we're looking at the full chain of moments that shaped the story we were given, and the parts that were overlooked, misunderstood, or never explained clearly. Watch till the end. The final piece changes how this whole story is remembered. After the funeral ended the way these things always do. A crowd that looked tougher than steel, standing in silence, because no one knew how to speak the right words. He had lived without fear, worked without apology, and rode without hesitation. Losing a man like that did not feel real. It felt wrong. It felt unfinished. And after the service, when the closest friends went out to gather what needed sorting, they stumbled on something none of them knew existed. It sat at the edge of an industrial yard where the city's noise faded into a dull hum. The building looked forgotten, the kind of place only stray cats and rust bothered to visit. No sign, no markings. Just a welded door so heavy it bowed the frame around it. Everyone knew his habits. Indian Larry did not believe in locking away anything. If he wanted you to see his work, his door stayed open. If he didn't, he simply never mentioned it. But this door was closed with purpose. The metal was darkened, like it had been heated, cooled, and welded shut more than once. Someone scratched into the upper beam a phrase that froze all of them in place. It said, "No tours." Not a joke, not a warning, a boundary he never broke for anyone. Right there, the question hit them harder than the funeral itself. Why would the most open man in the culture hide a place he built with his own hands? And why had he never spoken a word about it? But the story behind that building did not start with his death. It started decades before, Brooklyn's early garages. Long before television crews showed up, long before crowds asked for autographs, and long before the world used his name like a flag. He was just another kid in the rough corners of Brooklyn trying to understand the heartbeat of metal. The garages he haunted were not glamorous. They were dim, oily, loud places where you learned fast or got out of the way. Engines cracked open on milk crates, grinders sparked at odd hours, and half the advice given across the room sounded like warnings rather than lessons. He did not start as a master builder. He started as a kid, obsessed with how far he could push things before they broke. He learned by doing, not because someone taught him, but because curiosity refused to let him settle. Over time, something changed. The brute force repairs he had once done in a hurry began to take on shape, intention, even beauty. He started, seeing lines in metal the way artists see shapes in raw stone. The older mechanics noticed. They would shake their heads and say he had a strange eye, usually said with a grin that meant respect. By the early 80s, his name drifted through the underground like smoke from a torch. He was not famous, not yet, but he was undeniable. Riders brought him wrecks that deserved the scrapyard, and he returned them as machines with stories in their welds. He did not care about fame. He cared about truth. About making something that rode the way the road demanded. Everything that defined him later, the open honesty, the stunt work, the fearlessness, came from those years. Every risk he ever took started in those cramped Brooklyn garages, where he learned that real freedom did not come from owning a machine. It came from understanding one. And the edge he carried into every build followed him into the arena that took him. If you're locked into this story and want more deep dives into legends, truth, and the parts of motorcycle history nobody talks about, make sure to like the video, hit subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comment below. A day that never faded. The day of the stunt began like any other event that asked riders to push limits while trusting instinct to keep them steady. The fairground air carried the smell of fuel, dust, and sun-baked asphalt. Crowds gathered around the barriers, leaning forward with anticipation, knowing they were about to watch someone whose balance and control were part of his identity. He had performed the trick many times before. Those who knew him understood he would never attempt anything he had not mastered through repetition and discipline. The moment came without theatrics. He rolled into position with the same calm he carried into every build. The engine idle was steady, the cadence familiar. When he rose onto the seat, riding hands-free, the crowd felt the blend of danger and grace that defined his style. But on that day, something in the rhythm broke. The bike wobbled, tilted, and slipped away from his control. No dramatic flair, no spectacle, just a sudden loss of balance, followed by an impact that stunned the entire field into absolute stillness. Those who stood nearby rushed in, hoping it was another close call he would walk away from. Instead, the custom world lost a craftsman who lived by the line between chaos and control. The news spread fast, cutting into rider circles like a cold wind. But the real surprise did not come from that arena. It waited in the dust of a room no one had entered in years. While we keep moving, grab your gears and accessories below. First steps, inside the hidden workshop. When they finally forced open the welded door to the unlisted structure, the hinges groaned like they were waking from a long sleep. The first thing that hit them was the smell. It was not rot or decay. It was metal warmed by time, leather that had aged in silence, and old oil that clung to the air like a memory that refused to fade. Light pushed in through narrow, grimy windows, falling across benches lined with tools that looked as if they had been set down only a day earlier. The further they stepped, the clearer it became that this was not a forgotten storage shed. It was a working shop, one he had kept separate from everything the world knew about him. Wrenches lay on a bench beside a frame held in a stand, the bolts halfway tightened. Sheets of sandpaper curled on the edges, and a grinder sat with its cord still looped, as if waiting for the next pass. Nothing felt abandoned. Everything felt paused, like someone intended to return the next morning and finish whatever thought had been frozen in steel. One rider brushed a hand over a dust-coated tank and realized it was not dust alone. It was time layered across work he had never shared, work he may never have planned to reveal. This space held answers none of them had expected to find. What they saw next was not a memorial. It was the beginning of a truth he never shared. The frames with no names. Under the heavy tarps that covered the workbench area, the first shapes they uncovered did not make immediate sense. These were not the sleek lines he shared with the world, nor the refined silhouettes that appeared on magazine covers. The frames beneath the dust were sharper, stranger, and built with angles that ignored every traditional rule of balance and symmetry. One stood tall, with an exaggerated neck stretch that seemed to lean forward like it wanted to outrun its own shadow. Another curved inward, as if molded around an invisible rider. They were not mistakes, they were experiments. In places, the welds were intentionally rough, not sloppy, not rushed, but deliberate in a way only a builder with absolute control could allow himself to attempt. It was as though he had stripped away polish to reach something more honest. Anyone who knew his public work would see the difference instantly. Those builds were controlled, clean, exact. These were personal, raw, and unashamed. No paint, no markings, no numbers, no names. Each frame carried a kind of defiance, the refusal to follow an established line simply because it had been drawn before. They were sketches made in steel instead of ink, explorations that he never offered to customers because they were never meant to be judged. They were meant to speak only to him. But tucked deeper inside the room was a machine built with someone specific in mind. The matte black machine for his granddaughter. The next discovery came from a corner alcove, set apart from the chaotic energy of the other builds. A single tarp covered a smaller machine, one lacking any sign of showmanship or performance intent. When the cloth was pulled back, the light fell across a matte black tank, so simple it seemed to swallow the room's reflections. The frame beneath it was narrow, humble, almost quiet. Nothing about it hinted at power or speed. Instead, it felt intentional, as though every removed detail mattered as much as what remained. Across the tank, held in place by worn masking tape, was a handwritten line. The words were meant for one person. For when she is ready. Beneath that note, tucked carefully into a sealed envelope beside the head tube, lay a letter that carried a tone no one expected. It was not a farewell and not a lesson. It was a promise. He wrote about freedom as a responsibility, about writing as a conversation between restraint and possibility, and about trusting the road without letting it shape who you become. He told her that a machine built with honesty would carry her farther than anything built for applause. It was the most personal work in the shop, untouched by ambition, untouched by fear. It belonged to family, not fans. And if that machine showed who he loved, the next one showed what he questioned. The machine built as a warning. Far behind a row of stacked metal sheets sat a structure that did not reveal itself easily. When they shifted the sheets aside, they uncovered a machine unlike anything else in the building. Its frame was raw steel, scarred and uneven. The welds were jagged, almost violent, each bead laid down with purpose rather than precision. The stance was aggressive, crouched low as though ready to spring towards something unseen. It did not look like a bike meant to move. It looked like a statement carved into metal. Some elements were impossible to read as practical. A section of the frame carried etched lines resembling tally marks, uneven and burned into the surface. Small pieces of scrap metal were welded in places that had no mechanical function, almost like symbols. The front end had a stripped, skeletal look, the kind that would never pass inspection, yet held an unmistakable clarity of intention. This was not rebellion for rebellion's sake. It was frustration given form. He had built a machine to express what he could not say aloud. It was not anger at writers or at culture. It was aimed at decisions made far away from workshops and tools, the kind of decisions that favored branding over craft. The warning was simple. When industry forgets its roots, something essential breaks. And yet, the most honest thing in the room was not made of steel at all. His unfiltered voice. On a high shelf near the back, beside a line of dusty manuals and a cracked headlamp housing, sat an old plastic shoebox. The lid was warped from heat, and one side had melted slightly, as if it had once rested too close to a torch. Inside were cassette tapes, 6 in total, each marked only with short strips of duct tape. No titles, no dates. Just a single phrase scrawled across the top. No nonsense. They found a battered tape player in another corner and fed the first cassette into it. After a few seconds of static, his voice filled the shop with a quiet gravity that none of them expected. He spoke with the tired honesty of someone talking to himself at the end of a long day. There was no performance in his tone, no attempt to appear wise or poetic. He talked about authenticity, about how the work that came from his hands mattered more than anything he could put on display. He spoke about frustration, too, especially with decisions made far above the garage floor by people who never held a wrench. Across multiple tapes, he wondered aloud whether future builders would still chase truth in metal, or if they would be pushed toward shortcuts dressed as innovation. Yet, he held hope, a belief that somewhere out there, someone would keep the craft honest, even when the world made it difficult. Those tapes held his voice, but the wall behind the bench held his mind. The blueprint wall. He never showed the industry. Behind a false plywood panel, hidden by 4 stripped screws and a layer of dust thick enough to mute the grain of the wood, the blueprint wall waited in total silence. When the panel was removed, the room shifted. The air felt older, heavier, as though they had stepped into a chapter he never meant to publish. Pinned across the wall were sketches so detailed they looked like mechanical diaries. Each one revealed ideas the industry had never seen. Some showed frame joints shaped to redirect stress in ways manufacturers had dismissed for decades. Others mapped out unusual backbone curves that redistributed weight without adding bulk. There were modular brackets allowing frames to be reconfigured without cutting. There were fork angles that adjusted load transfer by pure geometry instead of moving parts. There were structural mounts shaped to reduce vibration through form alone. Nothing depended on electronics or modern systems. It was all mechanical, carved from the oldest principles of engineering, but pushed far beyond the boundaries accepted by mass production. Anyone who studied those pages could see how far ahead he had been. He was not designing to impress. He was designing to understand what steel wanted to do when it stopped being told to obey tradition. He did not leave these sketches to be sold or filed. He left them to be found. But he did not leave instructions for companies. He left a message for whoever cared enough to find it. His real philosophy. In the furthest corner of the workshop, near a fuse box that hummed with the faint tremble of old wiring, the smallest message carried the greatest weight. It was a folded sheet of yellowed paper pinned beneath a rusted thumbtack. The handwriting slanted slightly, tight and controlled, the way a man writes when every word matters. It was not an echo of the tapes, nor a repetition of the letter he left for family. It was something different, something distilled. The note did not talk about fame, pressure, expectations, or the noise that followed him through the later years. Instead, it spoke about honesty in craft. He wrote that a builder should trust the metal, trust the process, and trust the hours it takes to get something right. He reminded whoever might find it, that a machine built to satisfy the hands that shaped it would always outlast a machine built to satisfy a trend. Those words alone could have stood as his legacy, until outsiders stepped in. Before you head out, hit subscribe so you never miss the video. Every new piece we release connects another fragment of the history that shaped real writers, and you deserve to hear it the moment it drops. Lawyers arrive, and the fight turns corporate. 2 weeks after the first discoveries, the workshop no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a negotiation table. Legal teams arrived with polished shoes that clicked against the concrete floor, and voices that carried the confidence of people who rarely touched anything heavier than a briefcase. They surveyed the room with the detached calculation of auditors, not builders. Every tool, every sketch, every unfinished frame became an item to categorize. They debated ownership as though legacy could be divided into columns. The estate wanted clarity. Collectors wanted opportunity. A corporate representative wanted rights to anything that could be labeled intellectual property. They argued over sketches pinned with thumbtacks and metal pieces shaped by hand. They questioned whether unfinished builds counted as assets or personal work. They measured value in potential profit, not in the hours he had sweated over a stubborn weld or the instinct behind a strange frame angle. What he saw as exploration became leverage in their hands. His guarded work was exposed, copied, and catalogued, the workshop turning tense. Yet, while they argued for control, someone who had quietly learned his ways understood what they never would. But while they argued over property, one person was already keeping the work alive. Mouse, the quiet witness who picked up the torch. In a small garage, lit by a single hanging bulb, Mouse worked in silence. He had been there for years, not as an apprentice by title, but as a shadow, willing to sweep floors, hand over tools, and observe. He absorbed every technique, every instinct, every habit the older man displayed without ever asking for recognition. He watched how angles were chosen by feel, how tension in the frame could be sensed through fingertips, and how patience was the backbone of real craft. After the workshop fell into legal battles, Mouse did not argue or interfere. He retreated to his own space and began building, Not copying, not recreating, but remembering. He shaped frames with the same confidence in geometry. He welded with the same quiet belief that form should speak louder than finish. When he posted photos of his builds online, he left them unsigned and untagged. The machines spoke for themselves, and his work lit a fuse far beyond one garage. The worldwide builder revival. Across the world, in garages that never made headlines and shops barely large enough to hold a single lift, a quiet revival began to grow. It started with a handful of builders who had studied his odd rake angles and the strange backbone curves he once sketched without explanation. They were not copying him. They were learning from the language he had carved into steel, a language rooted in instinct rather than instruction. Some worked in backyard sheds with oil-stained floors. Others labored in converted barns, where the cold crept in through unsealed doors but could not dull their focus. None of them used his name to gain attention. They avoided sponsors, avoided glossy showcases, avoided anything that felt like performance. What mattered was the metal in front of them, the geometry they could feel beneath their hands, the craft that rewarded patience more than pride. When they shared their work, it was never through grand announcements. It was a simple photo here, a workshop clip there, usually taken with a shaky hand and posted without fanfare. And that movement changed everything the day someone tried to sell his work. The auction protest that shook the block. When a private collector announced an auction featuring pieces pulled from his workshop, the reaction was immediate and sharp. No one objected to preserving his work, but selling it felt like reversing everything he stood for. Word spread not through marketing campaigns, but through writers who still checked the same message boards they had used decades earlier. Photos of the auction flyer circulated alongside short notes urging people to show up, not to fight, but to stand for the principle he lived by. What began as a few voices grew into hundreds within a week. The morning of the event, the venue sat at the center of a block lined with motorcycles of every style and age. The riders who arrived did not come with signs. They came with silence, with arms folded, with a presence that filled the street heavier than any chant could. The auction organizers tried to maintain order, but the discomfort in the room became impossible to ignore. Each time an item was introduced, the murmurs from outside grew louder. Each time a bid was proposed, more riders appeared. The crowd was not threatening. It was united. The noise from that day reached farther than the organizers expected. When the government started looking closer, in the weeks that followed the failed auction, a different kind of attention emerged. Officials from a federal office reached out quietly, requesting meetings that sounded routine but carried an undercurrent of unease. They were not concerned about the man's reputation or the protests. Their focus was on the mechanical concepts recovered from his hidden workshop. Some of his structural ideas challenged long-standing classification rules that had remained untouched for decades. A frame that shifted its load path under compression. A fork angle capable of adjusting riding posture without complex mechanisms. A backbone design that redistributed weight more efficiently than conventional layouts. None of these innovations were tied to electric systems or futuristic fuel ideas. They were mechanical, pure, and surprisingly advanced. That alone raised questions in rooms that dealt with regulation more than craft. Officials asked whether these concepts could change safety standards, whether they would open gaps in vehicle classification laws, whether other builders might adopt them without the burden of compliance oversight. It was not a threat. It was a ripple felt where ripples rarely reached. But none of that attention mattered compared to the quiet machine waiting in the back of the shop. The last machine and the road ahead. Near the furthest wall of the hidden workshop, beneath dust that softened every edge, one final machine remained untouched. It sat lower than the others, as though built to carry its weight without effort. The frame showed marks of deliberate shaping, each line smoothed by hand rather than tool. The tank had no polish and no color, only the dull sheen of steel left in its natural state. What made the machine different was not its appearance. It was the stillness around it, as if the entire room paused out of respect. A folded note was wedged between the handlebars. It was shorter than the messages he had left elsewhere, yet it carried more clarity than anything he wrote before. The words were simple. Finish what matters. Leave the rest behind. There was no name, no date. It was not addressed to anyone specific. It felt like a challenge offered to whoever had the courage to understand it. Visitors argued over its purpose. Some said it was meant for a final ride he never took. Others claimed it pointed toward a new path he hoped to try. The truth was simpler. Craft outlives the hand that forged it, and his legacy kept moving because builders refused to look. If this breakdown helped you understand what really happened to Indian Larry a little clearer, let me know what you think in the comments. Writers who were around back then always have stories worth hearing, so add yours below. And if you want more deep dives into the legends, the history, and the truths this culture is built on, make sure to like the video and subscribe.